Motivation. Sources of drive. A software engineer accepts an offer at a startup with equity options, flexible hours, and a mission statement about changing the world through collaborative innovation. For the first 3 months, she arrives energized. She volunteers for projects. She stays late not because anyone asks, but because the work genuinely excites her. Her manager praises her contributions in team meetings. She feels seen, valued, necessary. When friends ask about the new job, she doesn't just say it's fine. She talks about it with the kind of enthusiasm usually reserved for new relationships. Then something shifts. The shift is rarely dramatic. The manager who praised her work starts responding to emails with single sentences instead of thoughtful feedback. The collaborative projects become assignments handed down without discussion. The equity options vest on a timeline that suddenly feels less like opportunity and more like handcuffs. She still completes her work competently, but the electricity is gone. Sunday evenings begin carrying that familiar weight again. What changed wasn't the job itself. The responsibilities remain essentially identical to what she signed up for. What changed was her relationship to the work, and more specifically, the source of energy fueling her effort. In those early months, she worked from intrinsic motivation. The tasks themselves provided satisfaction. The problems engaged her curiosity. The sense of building something meaningful generated its own momentum. She didn't need external validation because the work validated itself through the simple fact that it absorbed her attention and stretched her capabilities in ways that felt like growth rather than depletion. But organizations rarely structure themselves around intrinsic motivation. They structure themselves around metrics, quarterly goals, performance reviews, and compensation adjustments tied to subjective evaluations. Slowly, imperceptibly, her attention shifts from, "Does this problem interest me?" to, "Will this impress my manager?" The source of motivation migrates from internal to external. This migration matters profoundly because these two forms of motivation don't just differ in intensity, they differ in sustainability and in what happens when you consider walking away. Extrinsic motivation operates through rewards and recognition controlled by others. The salary, the title, the acknowledgement in meetings, the annual bonus, the corner office, the LinkedIn promotion announcement, all of these sit outside your direct control. You perform, and someone else judges whether that performance merits reward. This creates a dependency loop. Your sense of whether the work is worthwhile becomes inseparable from whether others validate it as worthwhile. A teacher spends her first year designing creative lesson plans because she genuinely wants students to understand geometry as beautiful patterns rather than arbitrary formulas. She stays late revising materials not because anyone will notice, but because the spark of recognition in a student's eyes when a concept clicks provides its own complete reward. 5 years later, she's still staying late, but now she's preparing materials because the district evaluation ties 20% of her rating to student test scores. The creativity has narrowed to test prep. The spark she's chasing isn't in students' eyes anymore. It's in her principal's assessment report. The work looks identical from outside. She's still teaching, still putting in hours, still producing lesson plans. But the inner experience has fundamentally transformed. She's now dependent on external validation to justify the effort, which means every indication that the validation might not come, budget cuts threatening her position, a mediocre evaluation, a parent complaint, directly threatens not just her job security but her entire sense that the work matters. When motivation lives inside the work itself, you can assess honestly whether to stay or leave by asking a straightforward question. Does this still engage me? Does solving these problems, building these things, helping these people generate enough inherent satisfaction to justify the time and energy required? When motivation depends on external validation, that question becomes impossibly tangled. You can't separate the work from the recognition anymore. The promotion you're waiting for, the raise that would prove your value, the award that would confirm you're not wasting your time, these become the reasons you stay, which means you're no longer staying for the work itself. Leaving something that still sparks your curiosity requires one kind of courage. Leaving something you've convinced yourself matters primarily because others told you it should requires confronting a more uncomfortable truth. You've been working for approval, not fulfillment. That your efforts have been feeding someone else's goals while your own slowly starved. That the exhaustion you feel isn't from the work being hard, but from constantly translating your effort into a language others will reward. Understanding where your motivation actually lives, whether it generates from your own engagement or depends on external confirmation, determines whether you're trapped by circumstances or trapped by needing those circumstances to tell you who you are. When intrinsic motivation drains away and external validation becomes the primary fuel, something more insidious develops beneath the surface. You begin constructing elaborate narratives about why the work matters, narratives that have almost nothing to do with the actual tasks you perform daily. These narratives function as scaffolding, propping up your commitment when the foundation has eroded. A nonprofit director continues leading an organization focused on youth literacy programs long after the bureaucracy has consumed the mission. She no longer spends time with the kids who first drew her to this work. Instead, she manages donor relationships, navigates board politics, reviews budget spreadsheets that determine which programs survive the next fiscal year. When people ask why she stays, she delivers a practice speech about impact metrics and the children whose lives change through literacy intervention. The speech sounds compelling because she's refined it through repetition. But if you asked her to describe the last time she felt genuinely connected to that mission, not intellectually convinced of its importance, but viscerally moved by participating in it, she would struggle to recall a specific moment from the past 18 months. Purpose operates differently than motivation, though we often conflate them. Purpose answers the question of why something matters in the larger architecture of your life and values. Motivation answers whether you have the energy to actually do it. You can believe deeply in a purpose while having zero motivation to continue pursuing it through a particular path. You can also have tremendous motivation, the flow state, the energized engagement, while remaining unclear about any larger purpose beyond the satisfaction of the work itself. When both purpose and intrinsic motivation align, you have what can be described as sustainable commitment. The work engages you directly, and it also connects to something you believe matters beyond your immediate experience. A hospice nurse finds individual patient interactions deeply meaningful, while also feeling part of a larger mission to dignify death in a culture that often refuses to acknowledge it. The daily tasks sustain her, and the broader purpose provides context that makes difficult moments endurable. But when purpose remains clear while motivation vanishes, you enter dangerous territory. You can articulate exactly why the work should matter. You can defend your choice to others with conviction. Yet every morning requires an act of will to begin, and every evening leaves you depleted in a way that sleep doesn't repair. You're running on purpose alone, which functions like driving a car on fumes. You might reach your destination, but the damage accumulates invisibly until something critical fails. A man continues practicing law in immigration cases because he believes passionately in protecting vulnerable populations from unjust deportation. The purpose remains crystalline, but the actual work, the endless paperwork, the hostile judges, the clients who miss appointments, the bureaucratic indifference, the cases lost despite perfect preparation, has ground him down to a nub. He stays because leaving feels like abandoning his principles. The purpose has become a cage. Even more treacherous is when purpose itself becomes unclear. Not absent, but foggy, shifting, no longer quite in focus. You once knew exactly why this mattered. You could have explained it clearly to a stranger at a party. Now, when you try to articulate it, the words feel borrowed, secondhand, like you're reciting someone else's reasoning. This erosion of purpose clarity doesn't announce itself. It happens through accumulated small moments where you notice the gap between what you claim to value and what you actually spend your time doing. The artist who started making sculptures to explore themes of impermanence and memory now primarily creates work that sells well at a particular gallery. She still tells herself she's exploring those themes, but privately she knows her creative decisions are shaped more by market preferences than genuine artistic inquiry. The purpose has blurred into something adjacent to the original vision, close enough that she can pretend nothing fundamental has changed, different enough that the work no longer feeds her soul. When purpose grows unclear, motivation becomes impossible to sustain except through increasingly desperate external validations. You need the recognition, the awards, the social media engagement, the reassurance from others that you're not wasting your life, because you can no longer generate that reassurance internally. The compass has stopped pointing true north, so you navigate by watching where everyone else seems to be going and hoping they know something you don't. Understanding this deterioration matters because it determines what kind of change you actually need. Sometimes the purpose remains sound, but the path has calcified into something unrecognizable. A course correction, changing roles within the same field, restructuring how you approach the work, renegotiating boundaries, can restore the alignment between what you believe matters and how you spend your days. Other times, the purpose itself has fundamentally shifted, but you haven't consciously acknowledged it. You're still committed to a vision of meaning that belonged to who you were 5 years ago, not who you've become. Those situations require not adjustment, but departure. Most people can sense which category they're in. They simply make excuses why it's not possible. The excuses sound different depending on whether you're avoiding a course correction or avoiding a complete exit, but they serve the same function, protecting you from the discomfort of honest assessment. Because once you clearly see that your purpose has either blurred beyond recognition or that your current path has diverged irreconcilably from it, you can no longer pretend that persistence alone will somehow restore what's been lost. Motivation fluctuations. Create a 2-week tracking document with 4 columns: date, morning state, evening state, context. In the morning column, rate your motivation on a scale from 1 to 10 before you check email or talk to anyone. Not your commitment to staying, your actual felt sense of energy toward the work itself. In the evening column, rate it again after your workday ends. In the context column, note what happened that day: a meeting that drained you, a project that absorbed your attention, a performance review, a colleague's resignation, absolutely nothing remarkable. Most people discover something uncomfortable when they review this log after 2 weeks. Their motivation doesn't decline linearly like a battery draining. It spikes and crashes in patterns they hadn't consciously noticed. A Tuesday morning starts at 7 after solving an interesting technical problem, drops to 3 by Wednesday afternoon following a pointless status meeting, climbs back to 6 Thursday when working independently, then plummets to 2 Friday morning for reasons that aren't entirely clear. These fluctuations feel random in the moment, but patterns emerge when you see them mapped across days. Understanding your specific motivation patterns matters because it reveals what actually depletes you versus what your anxious mind has decided should deplete you. A consultant realizes her motivation crashes every time she has client presentations, but she's been telling herself she's burned out on consulting entirely. When she examines the log, she discovers her motivation remains consistently high during research and analysis phases. The problem isn't the field, it's the performance aspect. That distinction changes everything about what kind of change she actually needs. After 2 weeks of tracking, identify your 3 lowest motivation days. Go back through that context column and look for commonalities. Write down 3 specific concrete elements these days shared. Not vague concepts like stress or bad energy, but tangible specifics: meetings that ran over, work requiring collaboration with a particular colleague, tasks involving a specific software platform you hate, days when you had to justify your decisions to people who don't understand your work. Now do the same for your 3 highest motivation days. What made those different? Again, be ruthlessly specific. A graphic designer notices all 3 high motivation days involve projects where clients trusted her judgment and didn't request endless revisions. Her low motivation days all involved micromanaging clients who treated her like a pair of hands rather than a creative professional. She's been considering leaving design entirely, but what she actually needs is better client screening, not a career change. Schedule a 1-hour block this week to research one alternative path that addresses your specific motivation pattern. Not a fantasy escape, a concrete option. If your motivation crashes during collaborative work but soars during independent projects, spend that hour researching remote positions or freelance rates in your field. If your motivation remains high for certain types of clients but tanks for others, research industry niches where the former predominates. You're not committing to anything. You're testing whether the wall between knowing and leaving is solid or constructed from assumptions you've never actually verified. Contact one person who has made a change similar to what you're considering, not someone who quit everything to backpack through Southeast Asia, someone who made a measured adjustment that addressed a specific motivation drain. Ask them 3 questions. What surprised you most about the transition? What did you think would be harder that turned out easier? What resources did you wish you'd known about beforehand? Write down their answers during the conversation. Don't interview them over text. Actual conversation forces specificity that messaging allows people to avoid. Pick your single biggest excuse for staying, the one that ends every conversation about leaving. Schedule 30 minutes to investigate whether it's actually true. If you've been saying, I can't leave until my son finishes high school in 2 years, spend those 30 minutes calculating what actually happens if you leave now versus waiting. Run the numbers. Research school transfer policies. Talk to a guidance counselor. You might discover the wall is concrete, or you might discover it's constructed from anxiety rather than facts. Set a calendar reminder for the same day next month to review your motivation tracking, not to judge yourself, not to make any decisions, just to notice whether the patterns have shifted, intensified, or revealed something new. Motivation fluctuates, but the patterns underneath those fluctuations contain information your conscious mind has been refusing to process. Make it visible, write it down. Test your assumptions against reality instead of treating them as immutable facts. If the tracking itself feels impossible, if you can't even commit to writing 4 columns for 14 days, that resistance deserves attention. You're avoiding data collection because you already know what the data will show, and you're not ready to see it confirmed in writing. That's fine. You don't have to be ready. But at least acknowledge that the resistance exists, that it's protecting you from something, and that protection always comes at a cost. Your motivation log sits on your desk showing 14 days of numbers that tell a story you've been trying not to read. The pattern is there, undeniable once you see it mapped across columns, but acknowledging what it means requires confronting something harder than just admitting the job drains you. It requires recognizing that you've been operating from the wrong question entirely. You've been asking, should I stay or leave, when the actual question hidden underneath is, what specific conditions sustain my motivation, and are those conditions present here? This distinction matters because the first question produces paralysis while the second produces information. When you ask whether to stay or leave, your brain immediately constructs elaborate arguments on both sides, each one reasonable enough to cancel out its opposite. You end up trapped in analysis that goes nowhere. When you ask what conditions sustain your motivation, you can actually observe, measure, and test against reality. This dismissal of warning signs isn't malicious or even unreasonable. It's protective. Your brain needs to believe that the initial surge of motivation you felt was accurate perception rather than honeymoon illusion, because accepting that you misread the situation means accepting that your judgment failed you. Easier to dismiss the warnings as cynicism than to consider they might reflect experience you haven't accumulated yet. Colleagues who tell you that you'll soon understand the real situation get written off as jealous or jaded. You don't recognize the alarms in the background because you're still operating from the belief that you're in the right place. What you're experiencing now, the crash after the initial high, the realization that external circumstances shifted the entire architecture of why you show up, isn't failure, it's information. Your motivation didn't collapse because you're weak or uncommitted. It shifted because the conditions changed underneath you. The manager who responded thoughtfully now sends three-word emails. The collaborative environment became a hierarchy where decisions arrive pre-made. The equity that felt like partnership now feels like an obligation timer counting down. None of these changes required your consent. They happened to you, and your nervous system registered them long before your conscious mind admitted what was occurring. When external circumstances transform the nature of work, when a supportive manager leaves and gets replaced by someone who micromanages, when a merger introduces bureaucracy that stifles autonomy, when a relationship that once provided encouragement becomes a source of constant criticism, your motivation doesn't gradually decline. It restructures itself around what's actually present now rather than what used to be there. Recognizing this distinction between then and now requires brutal honesty about what changed and whether it's reversible. Sometimes circumstances shift temporarily: a difficult quarter, a challenging project, a manager's personal crisis affecting their management style. Other times, the shift is structural and permanent. A company culture that valued innovation gets acquired by one that values compliance. A relationship that once involved mutual growth becomes one where growth threatens the other person's sense of security. You can't restore motivation by trying harder when the conditions that generated it no longer exist. What you can do is acknowledge that your initial enthusiasm wasn't delusional. It responded accurately to conditions that were genuinely present at the time. And you can acknowledge that your current depletion isn't weakness. It responds accurately to conditions that are genuinely present now. Both states reflect reality. The circumstances changed. Your nervous system tracked the change. Your motivation adjusted accordingly. The tracking exercises, the pattern analysis, the conversation with someone who made a similar transition, these aren't preparation for some future decision. They're acts of making visible what you already know but haven't allowed yourself to see clearly. Your body has been telling you for months, maybe years, what the numbers in those columns just confirmed. You've been working in conditions that don't sustain your particular nervous system's needs, and no amount of commitment or purpose can manufacture motivation when the fundamental circumstances actively drain it. What comes next isn't about summoning courage or waiting for certainty. It's about deciding whether to keep negotiating with circumstances that have already told you who they are, or whether to take what you've learned about your specific motivation patterns and test them against different conditions. Not fantasy conditions, not perfect conditions, just different ones where the elements that appeared consistently on your high motivation days might actually be built into the structure rather than occurring accidentally despite it. The data is visible now, the patterns are documented, the wall between knowing and leaving has been tested in specific places. What you do with that information is the subject of what comes next.